The Berlin Wall rose in a single night because democracy chose not to stop it. On August 13, 1961, President Kennedy watched East German guards seal the border between freedom and oppression, trapping 17 million people behind communist barbed wire. The young president, who promised to pay any price for liberty, chose strategic restraint over moral action, allowing communism its greatest Cold War victory. This surrender wasn't weakness, it was wisdom. Kennedy understood what his critics didn't. Preventing the Berlin Wall meant risking nuclear war over a city that was already divided. The president, who would later face down Soviet missiles in Cuba, knew that some battles weren't worth fighting if winning meant losing everything. The most controversial truth of the Cold War. Democracy's greatest defeat became its greatest victory. By letting communists build their wall of shame, Kennedy avoided World War III, while creating the symbol that would eventually destroy the Soviet Empire. Sometimes, preserving freedom requires accepting unfreedom, even when 17 million people pay the price. At 2 a.m. on August 13, 1961, East German border guards began stringing barbed wire across Berlin's Friedrichstrasse. American soldiers at Checkpoint Charlie watched communist troops divide families, separate lovers, and imprison an entire population. And did nothing. Kennedy's orders were clear. Observe, report, but don't interfere. This inaction represented the most controversial decision of Kennedy's presidency. The same leader who would risk nuclear war over Cuban missiles chose passive observation when East Germany literally built a prison around West Berlin. Critics called it cowardice. Supporters called it statesmanship. Both were right. The brutal calculation behind Kennedy's restraint. Berlin was 100 miles inside East Germany, surrounded by Soviet divisions and protected by nuclear threats. Any American military intervention would trigger immediate superpower confrontation. Stopping the wall meant starting World War III, a price no rational leader would pay for symbolic victory. But Kennedy's decision came with devastating human costs. Families were separated overnight. Workers couldn't reach jobs across the city. Students were cut off from universities. Lovers were divided by barbed wire that would eventually become concrete and guard towers. The youngest president in American history condemned an entire generation to life imprisonment for the crime of living in the wrong part of their own city. The most controversial aspect, Kennedy had multiple opportunities to prevent wall construction, but chose restraint each time. American intelligence knew East German plans weeks in advance. Military advisors proposed surgical strikes on construction crews. Allied commanders suggested accidental tank movements that would disrupt barrier building. Kennedy rejected every option that risked escalation. The most controversial defense of Kennedy's inaction. Allowing the Berlin Wall actually strengthened Western democracy by solving the refugee crisis that was destroying East Germany. Since 1949, 3.5 million East Germans had fled to the West, brain drain that was collapsing the communist economy and threatening Soviet control of Eastern Europe. Khrushchev faced an impossible choice: stop the refugee flow or watch East Germany disappear. The Soviet leader had threatened nuclear war if the West didn't recognize East German sovereignty. Kennedy understood that forcing this confrontation served no democratic interest. East Germans were already escaping to freedom faster than any military liberation could achieve. The Berlin Wall solved Kennedy's problem by solving Khrushchev's problem. Stopping refugee flows stabilized East Germany, while removing Soviet pressure for Western recognition of communist legitimacy. The wall preserved the fiction of East German statehood while demonstrating communist failure so dramatically that it became Western propaganda's greatest asset. Consider the strategic mathematics. Before the wall, East Germans voted with their feet against communism at a rate of 1,000 per day. After the wall, this human testimony to communist failure was replaced by visible proof of communist oppression. Television images of families separated by barbed wire did more damage to Soviet reputation than any CIA propaganda campaign. Kennedy's critics argued that preventing wall construction would have forced Soviet retreat and saved Eastern European freedom. But this argument ignored nuclear realities that made military confrontation suicidal. The president chose sustainable pressure over unsustainable heroics. The most uncomfortable truth: Kennedy's passive response to wall construction achieved more for democracy than military action could have accomplished. By letting communists build their prison, the president created the symbol that would eventually destroy them. While Kennedy calculated nuclear mathematics, ordinary Berliners paid the price of superpower restraint. Families woke up on August 13th to find relatives on the wrong side of barbed wire. Workers discovered they couldn't reach offices across the city. Children were separated from schools, grandparents from grandchildren, lovers from each other. The most heartbreaking stories came from families divided at midnight. 18-year-old Peter Fechter was shot trying to climb the wall 2 years later, bleeding to death in no man's land, while American and Soviet guards watched without helping. His death became symbolic of democracy's inability to rescue those trapped behind communist barriers. Willy Brandt, West Berlin's mayor, accused Kennedy of abandoning Berlin to communist oppression. The future German chancellor understood what Americans couldn't. The wall wasn't just a physical barrier. It was psychological proof that the West would not fight for German freedom when fighting became difficult. But Kennedy's restraint also saved lives that military action would have cost. Nuclear war over Berlin would have killed millions of the same Germans that wall construction merely imprisoned. The president chose imperfect peace over perfect destruction, a decision that kept hope alive even when freedom seemed impossible. The refugees who escaped before wall construction became democracy's greatest witnesses. Their testimonies about communist oppression educated Western publics, while their economic contributions strengthened democratic societies. Kennedy's inaction preserved this human evidence of freedom's superiority over tyranny. The most ironic consequence of Kennedy's strategic surrender: the Berlin Wall became communism's greatest self-inflicted wound. By building a physical barrier to prevent escape, East Germany created visual proof of systemic failure that no amount of propaganda could overcome. Every television broadcast showing the wall reminded viewers that communism required prison walls to keep people inside. Every escape attempt demonstrated that people would risk death for freedom. Every family separation proved that communist ideology mattered less than human liberty. The wall that was supposed to save East Germany became the evidence that condemned it. Kennedy understood this psychological dynamic better than his critics. The president recognized that visible oppression was more damaging to communist credibility than invisible refugee flows. The wall transformed East Germany from a failed state into a symbol of failed ideology. Consider the long-term strategic impact. The Berlin Wall became Western democracy's most powerful recruiting tool. Students protesting in Paris 1968 pointed to Berlin's division as proof of communist oppression. African independence leaders chose Western models over Soviet examples because the wall demonstrated where communist roads led. Latin American revolutionaries rejected Cuban communism because Berlin showed the price of socialist paradise. The wall also forced Soviet leaders into defensive positions they couldn't sustain indefinitely. Khrushchev had to justify why socialist workers needed barriers to prevent escape to capitalist exploitation. Brezhnev had to explain why the workers' paradise required prison walls. Gorbachev eventually couldn't answer these questions at all. The most controversial conclusion: Kennedy's refusal to prevent wall construction was the decision that ultimately brought it down. By allowing communists to build their monument to failure, the president created the conditions for peaceful revolution that no military intervention could have achieved. Kennedy's Berlin Wall decision established precedents that still guide democratic responses to authoritarian provocations. When should democratic nations risk everything to prevent authoritarian actions? When does moral outrage justify nuclear risks? Contemporary parallels prove the dilemma's persistence. Should NATO risk World War III to prevent Russia's annexation of Crimea? Should America threaten nuclear war to stop China's repression of Hong Kong? Should democratic governments sacrifice Taiwan to avoid confrontation with nuclear-armed authoritarians? Kennedy's restraint established that physical barriers don't determine political outcomes when moral barriers remain intact. The Berlin Wall couldn't stop Western ideas from penetrating Eastern Europe. Communist oppression couldn't prevent democratic inspiration from spreading through Soviet satellites. The lesson for modern democratic leaders: sometimes preventing authoritarian actions requires accepting authoritarian symbols. The wall that divided Berlin eventually united Germany. The barrier that imprisoned East Germans eventually freed them. The surrender that seemed like defeat became victory through patience and persistence. Modern authoritarians like Putin and Xi study Kennedy's Berlin decision, learning both its wisdom and its limitations. They understand that democratic restraint has limits, but also that democratic patience can outlast authoritarian oppression. The Berlin Wall rose because democracy chose wisdom over heroics, strategic patience over moral satisfaction. Kennedy's surrender to communism became democracy's greatest victory, not through military triumph, but through moral persistence that no wall could contain. The most controversial truth: the president who let communists build their prison actually created the conditions for communist collapse. By allowing visible oppression, Kennedy made invisible tyranny impossible to sustain. The wall that was supposed to save East Germany became the symbol that destroyed it. The barrier that divided Berlin ultimately united the world against the system that built it. Kennedy's strategic restraint achieved what military action never could: the peaceful destruction of the very wall that democracy chose not to prevent. Sometimes the greatest victory comes from accepting temporary defeat.